Welcome to another CMC podcast. Today's podcast is going to be kind of part two of the NASAR podcast that we had done a while back. What we had found is while we were discussing many things about it, we had really just scratched the surface on many topics. So joining us again from NASAR today, we have Chris Boyer. Chris, can you say hi? Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hey, Doug. Thank you very much to you and CMC for having me here. I was in the Marine Corps for about 10 years, serving my country at a high level. And when I got out, I wanted to serve it at a more local level. And I ended up joining a local search and rescue team in a California county and becoming a reserve deputy for them. And when I retired there, I got picked up by a private company that did aircraft crash recovery. Did that for 5 years and traveled the world doing it. And when that got old, NASAR picked me up, and I've been here this will be my 8th year as their executive director.
And also joining us today, we have John McKently. John, can you say hi? Tell our listeners a little bit more about yourself.
I will. Hi, Doug and Chris. Yeah, for those of you that haven't heard previous podcasts, my background is I just stepped down as the director of the CMC Rescue School, where I was in that position for 25 plus years. Prior to that, and really where I got into CMC, my hobby turned into a job. I was a reserve deputy and search and rescue team member in Los Angeles County, California, beginning in 1974. Did that for 47 years. Probably the late 90s, I was on the board of directors and the treasurer for NASAR for 4 years. So I have some background with that and have been long time involved prior to either CMC or NASAR involved in the ASTM standards process that we will probably get into a little bit more today. So, interest of full disclosure, I was the chair of Committee F32 on Search and Rescue for 6 years, and I've been involved in that process since the committee started in 1988.
Yeah, so actually this combination of both of you guys should work out really well for this subject, because on our last podcast, we got quite a bit into kind of the mission of what NASAR is, and then also some of its background. But we didn't really get a chance to dive down into the training and the certification aspect. Chris, you could kind of give us some background here.
Yeah, so NASAR, back in the 70s when we started, one of the things that the INSAR or the search and rescue coordinators were looking for was standardization, obviously, between states and between other jurisdictions. And that meant some kind of a standard. That meant some sort of common education, common certification. And so at some point, NASAR started doing that, developing the standards and the education, the certification. And then at some point, someone said, hey, time out, wait a minute. This is kind of self-serving and it's kind of antithetical. It's not very ethical that you set the standard and then you teach to it and then you certify it, that this should be done by separate entities. And this is where John's going to tell you about how that happened and how NASAR got out of the standards business.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Good lead in. Yeah, as Chris was talking about, in the mid-'80s, NASAR was working on standards. They found that it was very, very difficult because you have interested parties that were writing standards, and that was good. And that's how all these standards are written, no matter what the standards developing organization is. It's usually written because one or two people have a particular interest in it. But the problem comes because they are kind of limited by those people's outlook, either regionally or what kind of rescue discipline they're in or things like that. Realizing that, the NASAR board said, this is not only difficult because it takes a pretty big infrastructure for the voting and keeping everything good, as well as the review and, reaccreditation or redo of the standards process. And so they went to ASTM as an organization that at that time had just a little bit less than 100 years in the standards development business. And they went to ASTM and said, here's a possibility for a new standards opportunity for you. And it's a little bit, it wasn't the first, but it was a little bit different for ASTM because most of their standards were on things like materials. The first standard was on steel rail, for example, or cement or rubber or something. But they had gotten more into end user products and services. And so this search and rescue fell into that services category, and it was an early one of those standards. Anyway, NASAR board went to ASTM. ASTM sent out letters of inquiry to anybody they could find. He did a huge publicity campaign and had some opening meetings to determine if there was really the need, the desire, the willingness to help or whatever by people from the broader search and rescue community. And those meetings, I think the initial meeting easily had over 100 people. They had another one, and then they had another one. At that point, ASTM determined that there was a value to this and started the standards process under F32. From there, it's continued. It really got rolling, as I said, in 1988, 1989. The first standards started coming out, and it was very, very interesting because all those, I'm going to call them biases, and I don't mean it in a bad way, but the regionalisms or the things that, a caver did it different than a mountain rescue person, might have done something different than a dog person sort of thing. It was kind of a little bit of a painful birth, but the baby's still beautiful, and it's gone on now for over 30 years. There's legitimate standards out there. They're still being developed, and there could be a lot more. Again, it's usually a labor of love on the part of individuals, but the process itself where other people join in what we call an open consensus standard, which means anybody can chime in and they can say, this is good, this is bad, or whatever. They can't vote unless they're a member of the committee, which is not particularly difficult. It doesn't require anything other than $75 and an interest. But you do have to, if you do vote and you do vote negative on something, you can't just say, I don't like this because it's a bunch of crap, or I don't do it this way, or something like that. You have to offer a viable alternative and say, I believe this is a negative and it's not right, but this is the way it should be, and restate it. And what that does is it gives you a standard that does have consensus from everyone. It's probably not the strongest standard. They tend to be like a building code even. They might not be as strong as they should be, but everybody can live with it. And as time goes on, they get improved. It's a long-term process, and as a relatively young committee, we do have a lot of standards out there.
Yeah.
One of the critical things I think, John, you mentioned is that it is literally open to everyone to comment on it and to participate in the process. I know at ITERS here just a couple weeks ago, it was interesting how many people, went to that committee meeting to make sure that their opinion was either heard or to listen to what was going on.
And I should reiterate, when voting comes, you need to be a member of the committee, but anybody can offer input, either writing the standards or commenting on the standards without being a member. And all those votes have to be considered. They don't have to necessarily do what the voter says, but they do have to be considered, and the negatives have to be dealt with in such a way that you have to turn around and document, okay, that sounded really good, but it's a non-persuasive argument for this reason. And that's what makes the ASTM process different than several of the other standards processes, where committee members might be chosen for the organization they work for, the background they have, or something like that.
And the interesting thing right now, I think, John, the F32 committee has between like 75 and 82 members right now on it.
Yeah, unfortunately, the membership's gone down a little bit, but we did have good attendance, and hopefully some members come out of ITERS earlier this month.
The F32 committee sits underneath the medical processes and medical devices master committee, right?
Well, it doesn't fall into those committees, but the standard is published in the standards volume, the annual book of standards that you get as part of your membership. The F32 search and rescue standards are included along with emergency medical services and medical devices, which might include artificial bone joints and things like that. There's no hierarchy. It's just that they print a book that's the size of a old Sears catalog or something, and they just combine those committees together to put all the standards together.
Right. I think that's been very helpful for us in the past few years, because we're able to, realizing that search and rescue responders are going into an emergency where there is probably a medical issue that they have to deal with, being able to look back at that main standard area and look at the standards for training of medical responders and the other items they have has actually given us quite a bit of direction as we move forward.
Yeah, I think it's an happy accident that it just how happens that it was printed that way. Saves you looking at other standards. And I don't know the exact numbers because I haven't been the membership secretary for a long time, but there are a lot of us, myself included, that are members of both F30 on emergency medical services and F32 on search and rescue because of that correlation. It makes it really convenient to have the standards printed together instead of the search and rescue standard printed along with copiers or hot chocolate machines or rubber tires or something like that.
Yeah, and I'm seeing a lot of folks now also cross-committing to F39, the small unmanned aerial system, the drone committee.
They're going along with that. Then also some of us, through kind of an accident, are also on a sporting goods committee because there was originally a sporting goods committee that had a lot of climbing and mountaineering equipment, carabiners and X-axes and things like that. And that committee was dropped from sporting goods and merged in under F32 on search and rescue. Some of us, before the standards were moved, ended up on a sporting goods committee. So I get to vote on things like tree stands and surfaces for playing volleyball and how to test hockey masks and stuff like that I know a little bit about, but it's just kind of an interesting accident on that. Yeah.
Well, we focus very much on ASTM here, but there are some other standards out there that kind of swirl in the universe that push us a little bit in different directions. There's NFPA on the fire side, and there's what used to be called NIST. I'm not sure what the new acronym is for canines, and there are probably 27 canine standard setting organizations out there. But there are quite a few, and we try to cherry pick the best of the best when we look at, is this something we want to offer? Yes, then what standard should we look at? And that's truly the beginning of NASAR on that path of developing education certification to meet that standard. We try to pick the standard that's most applicable and move forward.
Yeah, I can't speak to dog standards at all. There are obviously a bunch of them out there. And, as an old-time dog handler, that's one of the
minefields.
For some reason, when the animals are involved, the standards get very difficult and very personal. We saw that in equestrian standards as well. So I'm staying away from that one. That's one of those things. And you mentioned cherry picking, and that's probably the way to do it because different organizations develop their standards in different ways. And I wish it weren't as complicated as it was, and probably dogs are the worst. And I can talk about the NFPA process. It's an industry standard. It's not as open as the STM standard. Some things are very much the same, and some things aren't. And the standards bodies tend to borrow from each other a lot. Part of that may be because the people that get into standards lots of times are on more than one committee. And again, in the interest of full disclosure, I am on several ASTM or NFPA committees. And let me give you an example. For carabiners, for example, the original carabiner standards were under ASTM. The carabiner testing methodology is under ASTM. And then NFPA says, here's the value that you need to have for a carabiner to get a G rating or a T rating, but you test it using the STM standards. So the standards organizations tend to, rather than reinvent the wheel, will borrow from each other and refer to each other's standards. And that's a really good thing because it's a lot of work, and it makes no sense to have two test methods for carabiners. Different types of things, and I know we at ASTM have tried to avoid some topics that are already covered under NFPA, and I think vice versa.
So once those standards then are formed, then that's kind of where NASAR's work starts then, right, as far as developing your programs?
That's right, Doug. Once we've got that standard in hand, we're able to use all of the knowledge I have of Excel to build a crosswalk of all the requirements. And we list those requirements out, bang, 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 linearly. And then we put next to it, is this something that is required as a knowledge, as a skill, as an ability? And then how do we test that? And we develop that certification first. It sounds odd, but you have to develop the test to the standard first. And that way we know what material we have to later educate to. So we develop that written test for knowledge. And then we, if required, we develop a practical testing methodology for the skills and abilities. And then we also look at, like firefighters, a sign-off of experience. And that goes back to skills and abilities as well. So we have a position task book system that we've been using here the past year for that. So once that part happens, And that's usually me putting that spreadsheet together. We start sending it out to interested parties, people that have shown an interest in it, subject matter experts, previous folks that have worked on it. From there, we start to develop the education. And the education part's the big, heavy lift, honestly, because that's the, if you need this knowledge, then how do I teach it? And if you need this skill, how do we teach it and make sure you retain it? And if you have to teach this ability, then how do we teach the knowledge and the skill to have that ability? So the education part involves writing a textbook or finding an adequate textbook, all the student paraphernalia that you throw into a class, a student guidebook, handouts, all that sort of thing. And then all the stuff for the instructor, because quite often these are updates or new items that the instructor has. And so we want that instructor to be able to give the best class possible to the student. And so we want to support them as fully as we can. And so that's kind of how it works. And then from there, we roll it out and teach.
And maybe if you could kind of give an example of what some of the practical items might be in one of your certifications and then how that task book system works as far as who can sign off on it and so on.
So let's talk about our basic fundamentals of search and rescue, which is education. There's no test to it. You take the class and you get a little certificate that says, I attended the class for 80% of the time. And then if you want a certification, you go to SARTech 2. And we have an online test now so that the instructors can spend most of their time, quality time with the student, the candidate, and the student can take that written test. It's open book, it's online. They can take it at their convenience. So then we go to the practical side of it. And one of those things is map and compass, right? Land navigation. So we look at the standard. The standard says, thou shalt know how to do this, this, and this. So we try to combine as many things together as we can. So, being able to shoot a bearing, a back bearing, do your pacing and that sort of thing. We build that into one test, right? And so that's the next step we have is that practical test and the things wrapped around it. And then we have to we go backwards and go, now that we've decided this is the test, let's look at the textbook and let's build the chapters and the PowerPoints or whatever, we're going to have that instructor work from to support those things and teach them. And then we still have to think about, like John very first started about, regional differences, honoring those regional and environmental and sometimes political differences that teams have. So teaching map and compass in Barstow, California in the high Mojave Desert is very, very different than teaching it here in Texas in the lowlands where, if you like blackberries, it's a good place to grow up. If you don't like blackberry thorns, then it's horrendous because that's all it is. It's impenetrable blackberries everywhere you go in forest. And then that's even different than teaching navigation up in Wisconsin or North Dakota, South Dakota, any of those flat states where there aren't that many landmarks to navigate from. So we have to look at that and consider how do we help those regional differences be honored.
I think that's something that always comes to me in my travels. I'm used to doing search and rescue, as I said, for over 40 years in a certain set of terrain circumstances. And then if I go to the East Coast, the Mid-Atlantic states or New England or something, or even Northern California, you're going to find very, very different vegetation and the ability to see somebody and search from a helicopter and tracking them on the ground and everything like that is very, very different. I mean, I think fortunate in California because we have so many different climatic zones in one state, but it's a big state. But it's Chris said, it's so different around the country. And in my travels and teaching and on my time on the NASAR board and even meeting other people around the country on ASTM trying to discuss standards is you have to make it so that it works anywhere for the standard or for the end result. But as Chris says, the way you teach it, the way the people operate are going to be very, very different. And that's what we have, that advantage of all of us on this call, having traveled and done so many things in so many places. But it's very hard for somebody that's only worked in one county and in one state and maybe not for a real long time. It's a tough nut for Chris, let me tell you.
I think you've really outlined nicely some of the challenges that goes into building those resources for not only the student, but for the instructor.
Right. And we haven't talked about the biggest challenge yet. The biggest challenge is honoring the fact that and respecting the fact that the majority of our students are volunteer professionals that have other jobs and have other expenses in their life, and that we need to price it and make it come in so that it's available to the vast majority of those volunteers. Our demographic for NASAR is, vastly professional volunteers. CMC, you guys are vastly paid professional firefighters or other, national park rangers and vertical people that are professionals that are paid to do that job, tower climbers, whatever. But for us, it's really trying to make that quality be inexpensive enough that we can get enough penetration out there in the market and get it around to people so they can actually help in their community.
Which, that's a very valuable thing right now, especially because no one's budgets are getting any bigger, that's for sure.
Right.
Keeping that price point low so that you can get the people involved, then how do you select who your trainers are going to be and your evaluators are going to be? And, what's the mechanics of that?
So over time, we've had this genetic system where you learn one, you practice one, you teach one. So where we take people that are very interested, very motivated, have the skill set, and we help mentor them by helping them teach the class under supervision until the instructor says, hey, these guys are good to go, and then we make them instructors. So it's a pretty simple deal. It's even simpler if that person has a lot of background in something and their agency is standing behind them and saying that they're willing to take this person on. So that's the primary way that we do it. I think that has to change over time. At some point, we have to provide more support to these volunteers that are trying to teach. Because you may get the best subject matter expert in the world, but if they can't teach and engage with that audience, then we've lost the audience. And we may have someone that's very engaging with the audience, but dumb as a rock. They just don't get the concepts and can't answer the hard questions from the students. And I know that John and I, in teaching in California over the years, we've tried out different instructors on both sides of this, and we've seen, how hard it is to find good instructors. So I think that what we need to do is find a way to find good instructor DNA out there, and then to support them with more education, much like NAEMT does, where they have instructor classes on how to teach and that sort of thing. I think that's going to have to be one of our next steps, is to provide instruction on how to instruct out there as a reasonable course of 3 to 4 to 5 days.
So kind of like an emergency services instructor type curriculum.
Right.
Kind of with the set goal of SAR instruction.
Yeah, sure. EMS has it. Okay. John, the fire department has something similar as well, right? For the fire academies?
Oh, yeah. For instance, in California, being a fire instructor, you have to go through a series of classes called Fire Instructor 1A, 1B, and 1C. That's what, for the CMC instructors, we ask them to have that or something similar, obviously, depending on the state that they're from.
Yeah, and elsewhere in the country, it's referred to as emergency services instructor, which is kind of the baseline for both EMS and fire instruction with multiple levels there. What then drives the locations and the frequency at which these hands-on classes then are offered through NASAR?
Well, there are two drivers. So we kind of run two parallel programs. The first is open classes to the public, and that's driven by public interest. A team calls us, or a jurisdiction calls and says, hey, we'd like to host a class. Once that happens, then we help them find an instructor near them that works for their community. In some cases, if it's a law enforcement jurisdiction, we try to find them a retired law enforcement officer. If it's a fire jurisdiction, we find them a retired firefighter. So we try to marry the correct instructor to the audience. So that's how open classes work. The other classes that we run are the closed classes, which are run by instructors for their local teams. So they're not open to the public. They're running them specifically for their local team, be it a dog team or a local ground searching team, or they're running them at a local conference or seminar. Those classes they're driven by the instructor and that local team. That local team says to instructor on their team, hey, we've got 10 more recruits. We need a X class. And then we help support putting that course on. And 80% of our courses are along the Gulf and East Coast at this point. We don't find a lot of courses between the Mississippi and Nevada in the Upper Plains states. There's just not that big a call. And probably because some of those states along the Rockies are more MRA type of teams because of the type of environment they're in. And Colorado has a very sophisticated training and education system through the Colorado Search and Rescue Board. So a lot of our stuff comes from New Mexico, Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, all the way down to Florida, and then up to Pennsylvania.
Just listening to this from the outside, if you will, from a search and rescue perspective, it seems like this would be very beneficial even to suburban and urban areas, as we discussed the last time, kind of for people that, have basically gotten lost or went on walkabout, maybe from a memory care facility. It seems like a lot of these concepts would really be valuable for a lot of areas that aren't using them.
Yeah, absolutely, Doug. Absolutely. So over the past couple of years, we've gotten the new initial actions course. Our search management course is a 40-hour course, but that's a lot for an agency to dedicate one of their few members to. So the initial actions course is a quick 8-hour course. We offer it online as well. Students can take it at their leisure to a certain extent. And so that course is, what do you do in the first 8 hours, that first operational period, while you're working on the hood of your vehicle? How do you not screw things up until you get enough resources from the local search and rescue team to start taking over all those parts of ICS? Because at that point, you're everything, right? You're the incident commander, you're the plans, ops, whatever, standing there at the hood. And then at some point, the incident's going to grow, and you need to grow that command staff and that general staff. And so that's how to do it, how to do reflexive tasking, to how to assess your environment and figure out what resources you're going to need and how many, how to develop a containment and some sort of perimeter of the search area. And so that's an important course that we have made available broadly, and it's being taken by a lot of folks, which is great. The other classes that we're giving, like FunSAR, it's a 40-hour course. Those are hard for agency people to get to. The staffing levels are such, and overtime costs and that. So we're looking at, how do we develop some basic 8-hour search and rescue courses that get enough of the basic out there that someone won't put themselves in danger, but they certainly can help in a search.
Well, it seems, too, that some of these things might help break down some of the barriers between different entities that may be responding to a search, such as, law enforcement, fire, Park Service personnel, and so on, in areas that don't have an active search and rescue team, per se.
Yeah, I think you just, took me to a different place. I don't know that NASAR is that big and that good, right? I think yeah, John could talk about that too.
Yeah, it's kind of different. Well, yeah, I don't want to go into it, but it kind of depends a lot on the areas that where the problems come are probably in areas that don't have a real high amount of level of search and rescue activity. Like, there's national parks that probably don't have any search and rescue activity at all, and they know that and they don't worry about it. Where there's other national parks, the Grand Canyons, Yosemite, Sequoia Kings, and things like that, where search and rescue is an almost daily event, and they have a very robust program, and the Park Service does have their own training for that. And then, for instance, in California, we've done a number of times done training at the national parks because they work with mutual aid resources from out of the park. Don't want to pick on national parks, but an obvious one might be, Liberty Bell and all those historic features in the middle of downtown Philadelphia don't have a lot of search and rescue activity, probably, at least not in the wilderness search and rescue activity that you might find in other places. So if they need some help, that's it. And again, in counties or whatever, but we're usually dealing at a county level for search and rescue, that they have the activity, then there's somebody there that does it. And ideally, everybody will all work together for the common goal of finding the person and putting everybody back together and having nobody get hurt. But it can be political and it can be territorial. And Chris talked a bit about that on the earlier podcast as far as regional differences and things like that. So we don't need to go through those again. But it's very definitely a factor. And the question is that, for instance, the fire agency, if they were the ones that provided search and rescue, it might be easier, but it would be tough to them probably to justify, I'm going to send people to some of these classes because the call volume for that might be pretty minimal compared to their normal medical and EMS and fire type responses.
Yeah. But it just seems like from what Chris has described here that at least some of these smaller, like the initial online class and some of these 8-hour classes would at least get people speaking the same language, if you will, in some of these areas that don't have it.
They know what the other guy was talking about. And the other thing is with the delivery, with these classes being available now more online and everything, it's a lot easier and certainly less expensive to take. In these recent times, we've all gotten so used to online learning and everything like that. Initial actions is something that I haven't been through the class, so correct me if I'm wrong, Chris, but it's something that you could do is an online thing. It isn't the same as a physical, I need to learn how to work a compass and doing it in the field or knot tying or any of those kinds of hands-on skills.
Correct. So the initial actions course you can take online. We divvy up the Zoom call into different rooms for the teams to work on stuff. We rely heavily on SAR Topo as part of that common operating picture or common situation awareness platform for the students, and it's a great way to do it. Yeah.
Yeah, I can see where the training definitely goes a long way to your mission of trying to get some consistency throughout the country in this.
Yeah. So the training certification and recertification, because these are all perishable skills. And we all need to look back at what we've used over the past year or two. And sometimes we get so comfortable in what the 80% rule is of what our call outs are that we forget that those 20% also are high risk probably. And because we haven't done them a lot recently, we'll have much more problem, accomplishing that mission or take more risk accomplishing that mission. So we need to go back and look at those other 20% things and practice them as often as that 80%.
Probably need to practice those more often. Yeah, because those are the ones you're not doing every day, that they're the ones that you have to think of, be it, no matter what the agency is.
Right. Yeah. The black swan events. And, we've seen those, things that are once in a career, once in a lifetime. Those words don't matter anymore.
One of the things about kind of going back, and we've already talked about it, back to standards, the standards all have a lifetime, and the requirement of the standards agencies, the ASTMs and NFPAs, is that the standards be reviewed every 5 years and revoted on by the committee. They don't necessarily have to change, although usually there are changes, but they need to have some currency. So every 5 years they need to be reviewed, and if the review doesn't happen, eventually it goes through a process where they kind of they just get abandoned, where if there's not a review, they don't revote, maybe they're not necessary anymore, then after 8 years the standards disappear, and that occasionally happens. They've been replaced with a newer standard, they're just not necessary. But because you're building classes on a standard, then it's like, hey, the standards changed, now what do we have to review in our classes? What's going to change there? It's the same thing that we've done at CMC, obviously. Hey, there's a new NFPA 1670 or 1006 coming out. What do we have to change? It's the same way with search and rescue. If, techniques change and things, equipment changes, lots of things change. You think about over the years, the amount of, Chris mentioned SAR Topo, but the electronics available not only for where I am and where am I going, but for managing a search. None of that stuff really existed a few years ago, and now it's just a common way to do things. I'm not sure people could do it. Some people couldn't run a search on paper anymore, I don't think. I'm not saying they should, but stuff happens.
John, you're exactly right. Our footprint when I first started search and rescue, our footprint was the back of an expedition. That was we had everything in the back of the expedition, and now our footprint's 2 large trailers with computers and printers and large format plotters for mapping and air conditioning and areas to do interviews and porta potties, which is kind of a nice addition. And so when you look at that, and then 3 years ago, who thought that drones would be the ubiquitous piece of toy that they are today in the U.S. I've got 2 neighbors with drones here on the street that futz around with them all the darn time, and they're having fun with them, and that's great. And the use of them in search and rescue is starting to expand, but again, the standards and it's the Wild West for the drones right now.
Yeah, someday we'll find that they found somebody, but right now, we're out there using them, and there's some restrictions, and it's the same thing with a lot of the cell phone tracking and some of those devices. Yeah, when they work great. What we've found in so much is people become dependent on them where they have cell service, but so many of our wilderness areas don't have cell service, and that really puts a crimp on everybody that wants to do it electronically. When it works, it works, but you better have that plan B, because those things don't always work, or the people have run their batteries down using their phone as a flashlight to get further lost or whatever they're doing.
Right.
So, that big footprint you were talking about, that's for those calls where you don't find them during that first or second operational period. And still, there's some percentage, I don't know what the number is, and it probably varies, that you find them during that route and location searching part. Hopefully you don't have to call out all the troops, but that's what we're planning for, because we know it happens some percentage of the time.
Yeah. As the Coast Guard and NOAA upgrade the SARSAT system as well, we're getting better data from that. They're going from low Earth orbit to middle Earth orbit satellites with better coverage, better pass times, quicker. When I say pass times, they circle the Earth faster. They are able to make contact with that PLB or whatever it is, the EPIRB on a much more active basis, and get us better data from it. Digital has gone a long way towards being able to make bursts that have a lot more data in them coming to us. And then the whole commercial market of personal locator beacons, the Spot and other things like that. California was probably the very first state that started to do stats on Spot activations and PLB activations, and what were they for, and were they really required, and how many were false negatives, etc. And you, I think, John, you worked a lot with the state SAR coordinators on that, right?
Well, yeah, and actually, I don't remember the numbers, and I could have probably pulled some out from recently about how many of them were what you might call real true emergencies and how many of them were accidentals. I don't recall right now, but unfortunately it has caused, I think, an increase in search and rescue calls. They're easier to complete because you oftentimes have good information of exactly where the people are, but there's been some really notorious cases. Probably the one that's most commonly cited was in Grand Canyon, where the people were like, I don't have any water, bring me water. I don't like the taste of this water. I don't know what I'm doing, that sort of thing, where there are so many people that are substituting having that device for common sense and some equipment and looking at the weather in advance and things like that. But, it does help us find the people faster when we know what's going on. And I think with the two-way communications and the newer devices, I'm really just speculating, probably is making a difference. Instead of pushing a button saying, I need help, it's like, what is your problem? And things like that can help a lot towards the search and rescue effort, and maybe reduce the number of what you might call false calls or nuisance calls.
Yeah, let that dispatcher literally talk them off the ledge.
Yeah.
So now, has all this new technology kind of driven any changes as far as the life cycle of certification? Do you need to do more frequent recertification to keep people current on this? Or has it changed? I would imagine it's changed the content of the classes significantly too.
So I think that the technology has its own parallel path to search and rescue. 10 years ago, it was Terrain Navigator Pro or Delorme. And right now it's SAR Topo, because that's a much more specific program for mapping. But it's, Esri ArcGIS is the standard in the industry for this sort of thing. But SAR Topo is a little bit simpler, a little easier, cheaper certainly for everybody to use. So I think that everyone has to run a parallel track of education and knowledge of the technology. Be planning ahead, because if you're running Windows XP, you're not going to be able to get access to the latest and greatest tools. You got to be on the latest and greatest as much as possible.
What is the recertification period then? Is there a set time?
Yeah, so John could talk to that a little bit, because ASTM actually defines it in F3069 or something, I think. But for NASAR, we believe it's a 3-year time period for humans,
Okay.
2 years for canines.
And then kind of one other thing you alluded to that I guess it'd be interesting. Do you have any training programs for the general public, people that are going to be hiking or something like that, focused on prevention?
Sure.
Yeah.
So we have a preventative search and rescue program at our website, www.nasar.org. And if you click on education, you'll find a thing called Hug a Tree or HAT. And Hug a Tree goes back to the very beginnings of NASAR and a relatively famous search for a couple of our members. So that's available for free. We make it available in 3 languages: English, Spanish, and French. And French is because of our friends in Canada. All the materials are there, multilingual, and it's perfect for teachers to present. It's perfect for scout masters or pack leaders or whatever to teach in their classes, or pioneer leaders, whatever it is. It's perfect for that. And we're currently working on a self-care in the wilderness environment online class, which is totally online, with the point behind that being, how do you prevent getting in trouble? 30 minutes out, you stop, you sit, you check your socks and your boots, and you look for hot spots. That way, 4 hours later, you're not making a call because you can't wear your boots anymore because the blisters are so big and bloody. It's a whole series of things like that to help the person who's not overly experienced have a good experience.
Yeah, that would definitely be nice, I'm sure, for more of the teams to be able to get that information out to the general public, because
Right.
the best search, I'm sure, is none at
Exactly.
all, right?
We're one of those businesses where we want to put ourselves out of business.
Yeah. Yeah, hopefully you can have the success like the fire service. You're looking over the last 20, 30 years with public fire education in the schools, that has really led now to, you got a couple of generations of people that are better educated. You're seeing the results. So hopefully the same can happen here.
Yeah, the parallel for that is the Uniform Building Code. That Uniform Building Code has made so many houses much more fireproof and much more earthquake proof, et cetera, that it's helped. And the same thing for us. There's legislation out there about enjoying the outdoors, going out of bounds in ski areas. So some of those things are making our life easier, but other technology will too. The personal location technology, as it becomes more broadly accepted, and it's not based on a terrestrial cell phone tower, it's more satellite based. At some point, we won't really have to search for folks. We'll know where they're at. We'll have a good set of coordinates, and we'll probably have maybe an idea of what's happened to them. And so it's going to be a rescue, and we're going to become very much strictly rescue organizations. I mean, and the start of that is your Apple Watch today. It's got the "Oops, I fell down. Do you want me to call 911" feature in it already. That's just the next step from OnStar. Oops, you ran into a tree or a phone pole. The next step is from that, what? Oops, you fell down, or oops, you seem to be limping, or oops, your heart rate's running a little too fast. You should get lower altitude. There are a number of ways that technology will begin to help coach that end user to stay safe.
As long as they listen to it, correct?
That's what I was just going to say. In the case of some of those things, they've got to listen. There's always that human element.
Yep.
And we can't forget it, but it would sure make it a lot easier. And as Chris talked about, the vast majority of search and rescue activity in this country, or in North America, I should say, is a volunteer. It's harder and harder for recruitment and retention for volunteers, just for all sorts of reasons that are beyond us here. But if we can make it so that you have fewer false calls or less wasted time, not only does it help the subject, the victim, but it also helps with the volunteers, because they're giving their time and it's valuable. And if they don't feel they're wasting it, they're more likely to continue with the search and rescue business.
Yep. And risk management keeps them safer. Every search that you don't have to go on, you didn't take any risk on.
Mm-hmm. I know years ago there was but before it was ITERS, when it was still NATERS, I'll leave the presenter's name out of it, but he kind of asked somewhat tongue in cheek, when we come out and we rescue some of these people repeatedly, are we actually interfering with the process of natural selection? So, but hopefully not the
hopefully
case.
not the case. Hopefully that's what we call repetitive education.
There you go. Yeah.
I was telling somebody just the other day about that, where we had one particular family that would go hunting in our area, and every year one of them would not come back until the next morning. We'd get called, 8, 9 o'clock at night. By then it was dark, and this is Southern California, and the temperatures weren't that extreme, but there was always somebody that didn't come in there and would search for them, and the next day they'd walk out, as oftentimes happens. And after the third year, we told the patriarch of the family to please go somewhere else to go hunting. But it was kind of like old home week after the second and third year, and everything came out the same, and they were semi-prepared. They're very appreciative and everything like that. But it was just like guys going out there and they're chasing that deer, lost all track of where they were. And again, they all came out okay, but we were always hoping there wouldn't be time number 4 when they wouldn't come out okay. So they just, some of them never learned, I guess.
Excellent. I'm kind of looking at the time here. This thing has went a lot longer than I initially thought it would, but I think that's always the case. There's so much good information that you have to share here. It definitely time flies. So maybe John, anything to wrap us up here?
Just my usual plea, and I got good responses off an earlier podcast about standards. If people are interested in developing standards, go to astm.org, go to nfpedia.org, look at the standards, think about it. It takes work, it takes time, but it's really worthwhile, and you benefit a lot of people for a long time by participating in the process. We're always looking for new people to participate in standards.
Excellent. Chris?
I echo John's words. The better the diversity, the better the standard. And then if folks also want to help write certification and education, we welcome them. They can find my contact information on the website and have them feel free to contact me. And then joining NASAR is another way of supporting what we do through membership fees and their vote.
Excellent. We'll make sure, too, we'll put in links on our website to your website and to some of the things we've discussed here.
Thanks.
So a lot of great resources. So thanks again for tuning in to another CMC podcast. And thank you, Chris and John, for joining us.
Thanks, Doug.
Thanks, Doug. Thanks, CMC. Appreciate the opportunity.